Ozzy Ozbourne is a man whose name epitomizes chaotic resilience and genuine rock and roll insanity. Clawed his way out of the depths of his own life as well as of music. Self-destruction, a life of tragedy, addiction, and near-fatal experiences. Yet he manages to remain a schoolboy who has been bullied in Birmingham was made fun of for having dyslexia by the lead singers of a band that gave birth to. From heavy metal to a solo legend, Ozzy has overcome all odds and had a life that few could. He has been banished, broken, and abandoned for dead, but he has never given up. How does a man can lose everything and still succeed? Once more, how can someone laugh when staring death in the face? This is the tale of. This is the case of a man who ought to have burnt out long ago but is unwilling to. John Michael Osborne entered the story of Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness. The world on December 3, 1948, in the center of the industrial. Born in a small home in the working-class neighborhood of Birmingham, England. Aston was one of 6 kids in a household that had financial difficulties, and his father worked hard in a. His mother put in a lot of overtime on an assembly line in the factory, and money was always. The house was always tense due to heated disagreements, and young John Wood. Later became Australian, he experienced alienation even in his own house because of the. Reading was impossible, numbers were a haze, and starting school was a nightmare. One was patient enough to see why dyslexia wasn't acknowledged in the. It was just viewed as stupidity in the 1950s, and teachers called him a failure. Students saw an easy victim, and parents lost hope. The bullying was. He was constantly pushed, ridiculed, and humiliated by 2 older boys. Really enjoys torturing him by encircling him after school and forcing him to. The irony of their brutality, nobody intervened or halted it, that was simply the way. There was no comfort at home because his father had already become hardened by the. Poverty's demands could not tolerate Ozzy's frailty when she called out for help. He received a severe smack or a belt, and his issues weren't addressed in his. Hopelessness increased as the family was hammered out of you, and by the time he. At 14, it got intolerable one day while he was alone himself in his. He took a rope, knotted it, and attempted to hang himself in the little bedroom as his. His father caught him barely in time, but his eyesight became blurry as the door exploded wide. Rather than consoling him, rather than attempting to comprehend his father punished him for it, teaching him that suffering received no pity but punishment. Ozzy's internal state altered, and he stopped caring. Knowing that school wasn't for him, he gave up at the age of 15, leaving behind a future. In any case, the world had written him off, and he had no strategy, no qualifications, and no direction. Grimm had to choose between hard labor and crime, so he alternated between factory jobs. Butchering animals in a slaughterhouse, painting buildings, and operating machinery he didn't comprehend. He was frequently fired for his negligence since nothing fit and nothing lasted. Making errors by just not caring, lacking a reliable source of money, and prospects, he turned to crime out of desperation rather than some elaborate plan. Needed money, and the quickest method to get it looked to be stealing, but Ozzy was never a mastermind. He was apprehended nearly instantly when attempting to rob a clothes store without having the funds to cover the. At the age of 17, he was fined and given a 6-week jail sentence. Confined in a chilly, dark cell with actual criminals who had accomplished a great deal. Worse than shoplifting, which is when he realized that if he continued in this direction, he would eventually dead or incarcerated for the rest of his life, but one thing had always. From the first time he heard the music, it made him feel alive. The Beatles' song, "She Loves You," struck him like a lightning bolt directly in the heart. The first time he saw a route out, it was through music, not with his fists or crime. He had no formal instruction and didn't know how to play an instrument, but he knew. He knew deep down that this was his destiny, so after he was released from prison, he decided that rather than dying as a nobody, he would become a singer with no plan, no connections, and no idea how to get started, but he had a fire inside of him that nothing could extinguish, and that fire brought him to a small advertisement that would permanently alter his life. It was unlikely that a rock band would find a vocalist in a newspaper, but Ozzy accepted it, and that one choice, that one call, sent him on a course that would transport the lanky young man from the chilly streets of Birmingham to the pinnacles of rock and roll history in 1968. A strange voice and a beaten public address system entered a dimly lit rehearsal space in Birmingham. Was known as Ozzy, but his real name was John Michael Osbourne. Had a tremendous drive to prove something despite having no official training or musical education. He encountered 3 other misfits in that apartment, including musician Tony Iommi, who refused to give up Gizzard despite losing 2 fingertips in an industrial accident. Bill Ward is a powerhouse, and Butler is a fundamentalist who has an interest in the occult. Drummer, they lacked refinement and polish, but they possessed something. Something distinct, something primal and dark and heavy. They initially referred to themselves as Earth playing blues-influenced rock, just like everybody other band during that period, but one day while rehearsing across from a movie theater, they observed a lengthy line of people anticipating the release of the horror movie Black Sabbath, which starred. It dawned on them that people were drawn to fear the unknown because of Boris Karloff. What if, in a sinister way, music could channel the same force that transformed their name to Black Sabbath and began penning songs that sounded more like sinister rites than rock tunes that would play on the radio? Melodies, their music was about gloom, parano, and not love and peace. The sense that something dreadful was hiding in plain sight. When their self-titled debut album was released in 1970, it marked a turning point. Black Sabbath's introductory track started with a faraway bell and the sound of rain tolling, followed by 3 of the most menacing, spine-tingling notes ever heard. When Ozzy's voice broke through on a guitar, the words, "What is this that stands for?" Logically, it was slow and ponderous, unlike anything the world had ever heard before me. Critics hated it, describing it as suffocating in its intensity. Harsh, ugly, and even demonic, but they were unable to win over the fans. Insufficiently, a few months later, they released Paranoid, and that was the end of heavy metal. The title tune, which was created in just 20 minutes as an album filler, was born. War Pig's powerful anti-war song is among the most famous rock songs ever. Anthem, one of the most iconic guitar riffs in history, was performed by Anthem Iron Man. The whole record solidified Black Sabbath's status as the forerunners of a sound that no one had a name, but for the outcasts, it was loud, ominous, and unrepentant music. Critics persisted in pointing out that the rebels were the ones who didn't belong anywhere else. Black Sabbath was much than just a band to the sneer-filled arenas, they were a force continued to push the frontiers of reality with album after album. Volume 4 was a wild introduction to sludgy down-tuned guitars that would impact generations of metal bands. Combining excess Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath with brilliance shone their ability to change. They weren't only getting by while maintaining their distinctive heaviness, they were controlling, but initially, Ozzy was devolving deeper into anarchy behind the scenes. All members of the band engaged in the rock and roll lifestyle, which included drugs, alcohol, and unending. Even if parties were a necessary part of the business, Ozzy gave it his best and drank from the morning while the others were still able to function. At first, it was fuzzy and unpredictable, and he spent most of the night snorting whatever that was placed in front of him. Crazy fun, then it became into an issue, and finally it was difficult to ignore him. Began arriving for rehearsals late, if at all, and when he did, he was either too inebriated to perform or so unpredictable that recording sessions ended badly, and he forgot the lyrics while performing. Tensions between him and Tony Iommi, formerly his closest ally, increased as his voice faltered. continued to deteriorate. The band was changing musically and trying out new sounds. However, Ozzy was mired in a self-destructive loop and trapped in his own universe. By 1979, it was obvious that something needed to change. Making the choice wasn't simple, but it. Tony Gizer and Bill sat him down and informed him that he was dismissed because it was inevitable. It wasn't only a career-ending moment for the band he helped form for Ozzy. Black Sabbath had been his lifelong companion, and at that moment, it felt like a death sentence. The only thing that had ever made sense was his salvation, and it was now gone. Ozzy's downward spiral continued when he was left alone with only his drugs and regrets. Confused, he locked himself in a hotel room and drank himself to oblivion. That his story was finished, but not because Ozzy Osbourne wasn't intended to disappear, and a fresh chapter was written amid the darkest period of his life. Going to start one that would make him even more special in 1979, the band he had helped form experienced the unimaginable. Had given him a sense of purpose, and the band that had elevated him from Birmingham's gutters to the pinnacles of rock and roll had. Ozzy wasn't simply untrustworthy, Black Sabbath had had enough of him. Was unruly, he arrived intoxicated, forgot the words, and skipped rehearsals. Because he was either too inebriated to perform or too erratic to be. Ozzy was out of Tony Iommi's grasp when his best friend struck him with the fatal blow. Didn't resist or fight it because he had anticipated it, but when the door shut behind him, the truth struck home, and he confined himself in a Los Angeles motel room with only medications and bottles and the crushing weight of failure. Days stretched into weeks, with no goal, no strategy, and his only company being self-destruction. He had dedicated his life to disproving others, but now perhaps he was simply a cleaned-up alcoholic, and he believed them completed, but destiny had other ideas, bringing in Black's daughter Sharon Arden. Dawn, Sabbath's old manager on Arden, had witnessed Ozzy's ascent. His tumble, but more significantly, she noticed something that he hadn't noticed. However, she saw potential where others saw a lost cause, and she wouldn't allow him to. Ozzy didn't initially trust her as she vanished into the abyss. He had lost all faith, but Sharon wasn't the type to accept rejection. Instead, she pulled him along. Informed him he didn't need Black Sabbath since you were the magic in that situation, and made him leave his hotel room. Band, you can do this alone. It was a crazy notion that Ozzy had never composed music sans Sabbath. He wasn't a composer or a guitarist. A frontman, but Sharon's efforts went beyond simply helping him get back on his feet. She was prepared to start over and rebuild him, with the first step being determining what. He met Randy Rhoads, a young, disciplined musician, at that time. Extremely gifted, his guitar playing wasn't merely good, it was with a thrilling blend of traditional accuracy and lightning-fast speed. He might transform the confusion in Ozzy's mind into something remarkable. When she first heard, he had never heard anything like him play, so he felt he was having hallucinations. Previously, something within of him awoke for the first time in months. He began to feel alive once more, and they began creating new music. The 1980 release of Blizzard of Oz was more than just an album, it was a assertion that Ozzy Osbourne was more than simply the member of Black Sabbath who was expelled. The album was an incredible work of art, it was something greater and distinct. Became an instant anthem thanks to Ozzy's eerie voice and Randy's unforgettable riff. Track after track demonstrated that Mr. Crowley was eerily dramatic and powerful. Critics were astounded that Ozzy wasn't merely surviving but flourishing, and nobody had anticipated that a man who had been dismissed as a drunken mess would return stronger than before. But Ozzy and Randy weren't finished. They released Diary of a Madman, taking heavy metal to new heights, just a year later. Ozzy Osbourne had officially been reincarnated at Heights, but his past hadn't vanished, but the devils remained, watching and waiting, and soon disaster would Strike that could take everything away once more, but for the time being, for the first time in a long time. Ozzy Ozbourne, when Ozzy had something he thought he had lost forever, was not only returned, but he had grown larger than before. The Blizzard of Oz had been a victory, but it was only the start when he and Randy Rhoads delivered Diary of a Madman in 1981. An album that expanded on everything they had created. The songs were more complex and ribs honed the energy in unmistakable tracks, such as Over the Mountain and Soaring High once more cemented Australia's leadership position in heavy metal was his own legend and no longer merely the member of Black Sabbath. However, success also brought instability. Ozzy was never predictable, but suddenly he was. He didn't simply disregard the rules, he did something completely different. Every performance they gave and every public engagement they made raised the bar for insanity, followed by the event that would forever define his crazy reputation. Des Mo, January 20, 1982. Thousands of admirers crowded the auditorium in Iowa to watch the Prince of Something Unexpected will appear halfway through the set as darkness takes the stage. A fan appeared to have thrown a rubber bat onto the platform, and Ozzy, who is always the showman, grabbed it, held it over his head, and then sank his teeth into it. Sunk in, he realized he had erred. It wasn't rubber, it was the actual flavor of. As the crowd went into shock and awe, security, blood flooded his mouth, hurried him off the stage, and he was given a rabies vaccination right away. Stinging shots directly into his stomach, yet rather than ending his career, the stunt turned into. Not only was famous Ozzy a rock star, but he was also a myth and a being of pure. The world couldn't turn away from insanity, yet 2 months later, the same planet would collapse at a tour stop in Leesburg, Florida, on March 19, 1982. After months of touring, the band was worn out but eager to continue. The morning began normally enough, but then the party stopped at on Andrew Aycock's home, their tour bus driver. There was a tiny single engine plane close by, and Aycock, a former pilot, chose to take it for a spin. It was intended to be harmless entertainment, a brief flyover, and a brief. Randy roars the young guitar in anticipation of yet another exhausting day of travel. Along with makeup, the prodigy who had given Ozzy another chance boarded. The band's other members and artist Rachel Youngblood Ozzy saw from the ground as the aircraft Aycocks were raised into the air to display their skills and start flying dangerously close over the tour bus repeatedly, but on the third pass, something changed and a wing clipped the car. A fireball erupted as the jet lost control and crashed into a house nearby. Randy Rhoads was only 25 as he sprinted toward the debris, and he was gone on impact. Screaming in desperation, he couldn't believe what he had seen only hours before. His best friend is musical, and they had been joking about future plans. The man who had salvaged his career, given him hope, and reminded him that his soulmate was no longer there. His motivation for enjoying music was reduced to ashes in the. Ozzy was devastated by flames and confined himself to his chamber, where he drowned in sorrow. He was incapable of functioning and didn't want to talk, eat, or. Existing without Randy meant more than simply losing a bandmate, it meant losing the person who had kept him afloat for weeks when everything else was crumbling. Refused to continue, but Sharon used sheer willpower to keep him from vanishing. She pushed him back onto the stage after pulling him back and getting him to stand. Wasn't the same and would never be, but Ozzy carried with his usual actions. Completed, he continued to endure the suffering, the loss, and the never-ending circle of self-destruction. He put out more records, performed at larger venues, and established an even larger legacy, but his internal turmoil persisted despite his accomplishment. His drug and alcohol addictions were at their worst in the late 1980s. Behavior was in a never-ending downward spiral, and Sharon had been his rock savior, but even she had boundaries. and one evening in 1989, he went beyond what. Even she was unable to ignore being drunk and hardly aware of reality. Ozzy turned to face Sharon and muttered something that would come back to haunt them both. He lunged, deciding that you had to die before she could react. She resisted and gasped as he put his hands around her throat, strangling her. Her vision began to fade, but security quickly intervened and pulled Ozzy away. Gone, the police came and arrested him before he could complete what he had begun. He had no memory of what he had done when he first woke up in a detention cell, nor did he recall the exact minute he had often come dangerously close to killing the one person who had spared his life. Ozzy's life was at stake when the judge ordered him into rehab. It wasn't simply about preserving his job. Wasn't only another rock star scandal. If he didn't change, it would be a breaking point. Despite the fact that he would not live, the story continued because of Ozzy Ozbourne. Wasn't finished fighting yet, and the Prince of Darkness's legend wasn't over yet. Being a rock star isn't only. The cost of the song is what matters, and for Ozzy Ozbourne, that fame came with fortune, but the cost has been more than most could ever bear. It also resulted in lawsuits, near-death experiences, and a body that was so severely damaged but somehow. Despite everything, Ozzy is still standing in 1984. He was at one of Suicide Solution's songs from his first solo album, The Center of a Firestorm, was intended to represent alerting people to the risks of alcohol misuse, but when John Daniel McCullum, then 19 years old, tragically allegedly listened to the song that his family blamed him for, and then ended his own life. Ozzy was sued on the grounds that the music carried hidden messages. The media seized on the dispute and portrayed him as a dangerous person, inciting suicide. Influence a youth corrupter, but Ozzy resisted, insisting there was never any subliminal message, just the harsh reality of addiction. Ultimately fired, but it permanently damaged his law career. Physical survival was one thing, but conflicts were another. Fast forward to